That's promising. Yay, computer, thank you. Okay.
Okay.
And we've got confirmation on the wireless device. Okay, so good. Well, now afternoon definitely. Good afternoon to everyone. So we talked Pinchas this week. This is one of the many parshiot from Bamidbar, from this part of Numbers, that I often don't get to teach because of vacation schedules and Torah schedules. So I'm always excited to be able to teach it. But this week we're going to talk about the non-exciting part of the parasha, because we keep.
Part?
Wow. Well, so we're gonna move to chapter 28, and we're gonna talk about sacrifices. Because if you are a regular synagogue attendee, or if you are a regular devotee of the morning service, you'll know that chapter 28 and chapter 29 are what we call the maftir portion. Right? This is where you'll usually have at least one Torah in the Ark rolled to almost the entire year. Because we will read selections from this for Rosh Chodesh, we'll read selections of this on all the holidays. This is where we find the listings of different sacrifices for different events. And so this becomes a very regular feature for any regular synagogue goer. And it's also something that rarely gets talked about because it just doesn't seem very exciting. We read it out of some sense of obligation because, it's what you're supposed to do. But what are we actually supposed to be learning from this? What are we supposed to be feeling about this? Well, hopefully I'll give you some ideas today so that the next time this rolls around, get it? Rolls around, it's a scroll. The next time this rolls around, it's Torah reading humor, you'll hopefully be able to connect to it as something more than just the pause before the Haftarah. Good? Okay, so we are on page 929. And we are beginning with chapter 28, verse 1. And I'm going to look to my volunteer. You up for it?
I'll volunteer.
Okay.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command the Israelite people and say to them, be punctilious in presenting to me at stated times the offerings of food due me as gifts of a pleasing odor to me."
Okay, so what, we haven't had a conversation about sacrifices before?
Yeah.
So it's a slightly different ordering in the sense that we're focusing here entirely on the sacrifices that come b'moado, in God's times, meaning at the appropriate moments in the calendar. So unlike sacrifices which might be done as a free will offering, or unlike sacrifices that might be done as a sin offering, those are contingent upon our actions or our feelings at a time. These are contingent on the calendar. So this is a sacrificial calendar list. And as such, we're going to need to hear some of the different things.
Yep. Say to them, these are the gifts that you are to present to the Lord. As a regular burnt offering every day, 2 yearling lambs without blemish. You shall offer 1 lamb in the morning, and the other lamb you shall offer at twilight. And as a grain offering, there shall be 1/10 of an ephah of choice flour with 1/4 of a hin of beaten oil mixed in. The regular burnt offering instituted at Mount Sinai, a gift of pleasing odor to the Lord.
Go ahead. Yeah,
The libation with it shall be 1/4 of a hin for each lamb, to be poured into the sacred precinct as an offering of fermented drink to the Lord. The other lamb you shall offer at twilight, preparing the same grain offering and libation as in the morning, a gift of pleasing odor to the Lord. And on the Sabbath day, 2 yearling lambs without blemish, together with 2/10 of a measure of choice flour, with oil mixed in as a grain offering, and with the proper libation, a burnt offering for every Sabbath, in addition to the regular burnt offering and its libation.
All right, who's engaged?
Yeah, right.
Who's excited?
How exciting.
Right? Noticing all of these amazing.
Yeah.
I've got questions here.
Okay.
Which is,
Ready?
yeah,
Go
it's like, go figure. Where'd they get the flour? They're in the desert.
Right?
Where is their wheat field?
There aren't wheat fields.
Pardon?
There aren't wheat fields in the desert.
So the flour, I know that. I mean, so how are they getting flour and oil, and they're fermenting something from a lamb to make into an alcoholic beverage.
Pardon?
What's that thing?
No. You mean the number 7, verse 7, libation?
No, the fermented drink.
Yeah, verse 7.
Quarter of the hin of the lamb.
Right.
Yeah.
For the lamb.
Right. So that is fermenting is not like unusual, but that goes with the lamb, not of the lamb.
Oh.
So it's not fermented lamb juice, which is
But like-
not a drink anyone's ever asked for. I don't even think that's the name of a cocktail. What? They can make it from all sorts of things, right? So
they don't have.
but the more important point is that we let me do a quick map because it's just important to remember, right? We've got
Yeah, we're still carrying 27 years later.
Now,
so that I missed that. Hold on a second. There we go. That'll work better. All right. So we've got the Sinai Peninsula here, and we've got the Jewish people in the Sinai. And that means they are cut off from the rest of the world, never to see another human being for 40 years. No, of course not. Right? Well, the Sinai Peninsula was a huge trade route, right? From people coming from Arabia and people coming from the Levant, to use the classic term. And that passed right through where we were hanging out. Remember, when it talks about us wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, it wasn't like we were looking at our compass and wondering where to go. And in fact, we weren't even journeying most days.
Right.
The vast majority of the time that we spent in the wilderness was spent right about there, just hanging out. What? Camping, exactly. But camping in very sturdy, nice tents, not some Coleman reject. So we were able to tap into a lot of the ongoing trade in order to get some of the things that we needed. Now, that was completely insufficient, especially given our own internal resources and ability to then barter to support us. Right? So we couldn't live off of that. But absolutely, we could access that to some degree. And of course, once we moved into the land of Israel, these were the standard behaviors that were supposed to continue. But we're not talking about a lot here. Remember, we're talking about offerings here that are offerings for the entire nation of a couple sheep.
Right.
This is not a huge burden on the entire nation to be able to come up with a couple sheep or a little bit of extra grain for these things. So it's not at all unreasonable to imagine them being able to provide this during the wilderness time. And of course, once they were in Israel, it would have been quite easy. In fact, we all know that there was a tax that provided for all of the daily offerings that was known as the half shekel tax, the chetzi shekel that we talked about earlier back in the book of Exodus.
But if they're in the middle of all these other peoples there, you don't want the Jewish people to take on their method of praying to their various idols. So this is God reminding us, you give me an offering in my way because I'm the one God. Never mind what those guys are doing.
Okay, but then we get into a big question, which is going to be our nice segue to our texts, our commentaries, which is, how is this different than what the other people of the ancient world did? If you were to go into a Canaanite city, if you were to go into an Egyptian city, if you were going to go into a Midianite, who we've been talking about, or Moab, or any of the other people, and watch them worship their gods, I can guarantee you there would have been an animal, and there would have been some form of liquid, and there would have been some form of grain that was being offered in some combination to their in service of their gods. So although it's true that the thing at the front of the room was very different because we didn't have a statue at the front of our room, the fact that we were offering sacrifices was very similar to the sacrifices that were being offered in other places. So what was God thinking when he had us do this? Why is God instituting sacrifices in the first place? Why is he telling us that we need to be careful and watchful to make sure that these sacrifices occur?
Maybe he's helping us grow up where we can actually get to prayer and understand that that's the case. If everybody else is offering sacrifice and we're just talking into the earth, please God help me, it sounds like you're being too cheap.
Oh,
Like you're not, you don't want to really do anything.
right. There's a certain keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah,
and,
we're not
and
grown up enough to do the other.
in previous years for Leviticus, we have talked about that sacrifices may have been given as a aid to humanity, to the Jewish people who only knew of sacrificial worship and weren't ready to make a full jump. That's where you get into a debate about whether or not sacrifices will be reconstituted in the future. But that also means that it would have been in perpetuity if the temples hadn't been destroyed, that we would have been stuck in this proto-archaic form of worship. Is that really what God was offering to us? And if we look carefully at verse 2, right, back just at the top, just at the top of 9:30, right, that we are doing these offerings of food, do me, right? These are my food, right? And they are gifts of pleasing odor to me, right? Reach nichoach. I mean, if you are a familiar Torah reader, you'll hear those phrases over and over again, that this is a pleasing odor. God apparently sees these as food, and God apparently likes the way they smell. What's the problem with that?
You're leaving out at its appointed time.
Well,
Because there's a whole,
God doesn't
whole
need to
thing
eat.
with time going on here about how we regulate time, how we recognize time, because the whole idea of Shabbat observance.
So I like
This
this.
is new.
So I like the smell of toast at breakfast.
Yeah, but
Or how many people love, not me personally, but how many people need the smell of coffee in the morning? Right? I mean, it seems to be very anthropomorphic, doesn't it?
Is it what is being sacrificed, or the fact that this is being done at this time?
Okay, so let's see what we can do.
Yeah.
Because these passages have not disappeared. In fact, they continue to be part of our daily liturgy as well, at least traditionally, as part of our preliminary services, as well as I mentioned, as part of our regular cycle of Torah readings in Maftir sections. So we're going to start off with a little bit about the daily service. Everyone can still hear me over the rain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the rain's a little early today.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
So the asphalt guys then.
So we've got 3 blessings that are done in rapid succession in the morning service. And this is the version that's found in Rambam's Mishnah Torah. There are some slight differences between this version and the standard Ashkenazic version that's found in our Sidur, but they're close enough that I hope you don't mind the little bits of difference. And besides, unless you're actually there at the beginning of services, you may not have heard these blessings, because we don't say them at 10:30, we say them at 9:30. All right, so for a review or for a first look at the blessings we say about Torah in the morning.
The first one is, who has sanctified us by your commandments and given us a command concerning the words of the Torah.
Right, la'asok b'divrei Torah, to work with, to toil in, to be engaged with the words of Torah. And then immediately afterwards,
Make pleasant, we beseech you, Lord our God, the words of your Torah in our mouth and in the mouth of your people, all the house of Israel, so that we, with our offspring and the offspring of your people, all the house of Israel, may know your name and learn your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Lord, who teaches the Torah.
all right, so after having said that we thank God for the gift of asking us to fulfill the commandment of toiling in the Torah, of working with the Torah, we then say, now that we're doing it, make it nice, and make it something that goes not only for us, but for our descendants and for the whole community, and make us do it for the right reason. When we say learn it for its own sake, right? Torah lishma is considered one of the highest goal, to study Torah just because we want to study Torah. And then we round it out with a blessing that may sound more familiar if you're used to doing an aliyah.
Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has chosen us from all nations and given us your Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord, who gives the Torah.
Right? Notein HaTorah, which is the blessing that you're familiar from having an aliyah. So 1, 2, 3, we've just said blessings about God's gift of Torah. What do we do after we've said a blessing? We do the thing that we've said a blessing about, right? If I say a blessing about eating fruit from the tree, I better have an apple in my hand or some other fruit from the tree. If I say a blessing about wearing a talit, I better be putting the talit on it. Less, of course, if I'm doing it as an educational purpose. So if we've said blessings about the gift of Torah, the mitzvah of Torah, and the blessing of Torah, we better do some Torah.
And so it is a duty to recite these 3 blessings daily and then read a small portion of the words of the Torah. The people have the custom to read the priestly benediction.
Right, that's the Kohanim's blessing.
Right, oh, that's right. In some places, the section referring to the daily sacrifices is read.
Bing, bing, bing. There's our Torah portion.
In others, again, both these sections are read.
Right, some places they do both.
Chapters or paragraphs from the Mishnah or the Baraita are also read.
Right. So, and as he's pointing out, that in his day, which is about 1,000 years ago, there were a number of different options that he was familiar with of how people would fulfill the mitzvah of studying Torah immediately after having said the blessing about studying Torah. And one of the options is to read the daily sacrifice lists. Now, nowadays, you'll find as well, people in our Siddur will still do the blessings from the priests. Will, also do a section of Mishnah as well as from the Talmud, talking about the things that have no measure. And then there are other selections as well from the Torah and also from the Mishnah that are included in our Siddur. In many other Siddurs, there will be the daily sacrifices that we've mentioned, which is taken from our chapter here. You can also find in many Siddurs the selection of the Akedah, the binding and almost sacrifice of Isaac. So there's a variety of different texts that have been used to study Torah to fulfill this mitzvah right after we said it. And this blessing, by the way, is good all day long. So if you've said the blessing once and you engage in a little Torah study, you don't have to say it again every time you open up the book.
So this is the transition from actually sacrificing animals to several thousand years in the future, when we just we mention that we sacrifice the animals, but we don't have.
All right, which brings me to the question of all the passages from the Torah to begin our daily service, our own, because remember, this isn't the service, this is the preliminary part of our own warming up to be prepared to do the formal service. If you were going to pick a section of the Torah that would stir the soul in the morning and get you to really feel a sense of gratitude to God for the gift that he has given to us of Torah, I'm willing to guess, I'm not going to force anyone to be embarrassingly raise your hand, that most of you would not pick the daily sacrifice section that we just read as being, that's what I want at 7:30 in the morning. That's exactly what I need to hear. And that's going to make me say, Torah. Now, there is one benefit, which is if you want to prove that you're studying Torah lishma, for its own sake, then picking a passage that no one would want to read just because they liked it is a good reason, is a good way to pick a passage that shows I'm only studying this because I love all of Torah, because I don't love this passage. Right? It is a sort of inverted logical way of saying, if I pick my least favorite passage, then no one can question that I'm studying this for its own sake, meaning, just because God told me to. No one's going to accuse me of enjoying this. But on the other hand, we do also sort of want to enjoy it. So why daily sacrifices be something to mention over and over again every day in many communities' daily life? Because what does this mean? Right? And you might think, however, that, well, maybe this fixation on sacrifices as part of the daily average person's routine is a bit new, but it's not. The fixation on the daily sacrifices as part of the national identity is something that's been around for quite some time, as we're going to see from Rashi's quote.
This implies that priests, Levites, and ordinary Israelites shall stand by watching when the sacrifices are offered. From this command, they derive the law of ma'amadot, which would be the representatives of the people.
Literally the standards, right? So when the sacrifices were being offered in the temple, or in the Mishkan for that matter, it wasn't like everybody in the country came and watched. Remember, it's only two sheep and the accompanying libation bits. So how are the rest of us meant to connect to this? How are the rest of us meant to participate in this? We're not priests. We can't actually do it. We're not even bringing these lambs because those are being bought with the half shekel money through the priests themselves. Well, they instituted that there would be representatives of the people, ma'amadot, who would stand by, and they would be there at the time of the daily sacrifices, representing the nation, so that the people would have a part in the daily sacrifice. It wouldn't only be the priests alone with God, that the rest of us would be there too, at least through our representatives, who were our representatives, rather than the priests, who were a little separate from the rest of us. Make sense?
No,
No.
because that means that if you're doing Shabbat, you're my representative observing Shabbat, so
Right.
I don't have to. I can go out shopping or whatever, because you're my representative.
So
I don't have to-
definitely we can't do a substitute representative for the average mitzvah.
Yeah.
And this isn't asking for them to do it on our behalf in the sense that I would normally do the sacrifice, but now these other people are. The average person couldn't do the sacrifice, right? I'm not a Kohen. Even if the temple was alive and well and turning out the sacrifices on a regular basis, no matter what, I would not be allowed to go into its innermost precincts and up to the altar and to perform a sacrifice. That commandment was simply given to the Kohanim, not to me, no matter what. However, the rabbis understood this verse, our opening lines of chapter 28, as saying, but the average person is invested in the sacrifices, and we need to have their representatives there too. Now, they're not doing the slaughter because they can't, but they need to be present.
This is different than other commands with the sacrifices, because previously it was command the Levites. Here's command the children of Israel. So everybody is included.
Right.
And see to it that this gets done.
And yet we know they can't do it themselves.
Right.
And that's why Sifrei, the Midrash collection, earliest Midrash collection, is saying there were these representatives. That was fulfilling the idea that the children of Israel were doing it, even though it was the Kohanim doing it.
Also, it seems to me that there might have been a tendency for the Levites and the Kohanim doing the sacrifices is kind of like a secret rite.
Right.
By saying you have to have the people there watching you,
Mhm.
observing it, it keeps it from becoming a kind of closed ritual magic kind of.
Right. So in addition to making sure that there is the presence of the nation there, it also makes sure that there is the supervision of the nation there.
Right.
It's not only that they are allowed to be present and participate in this by being there, but they also prevent it from becoming a private exclusionary practice only among the priests or Levites, and they make sure that it's done according to the halakha. I mean, not that they would necessarily be the experts, but if they see them bringing in a pig or bringing in an ox, they go, wait a minute, I don't think that's what we were supposed to be sacrificing. Or if they see them using doves, which were the cheaper alternatives for some sacrifices, again, they could say, well, that's not what my half shekel was paying for. Right? We were promised sheep, I want sheep. So that seems to also be a second, a parallel function of having these ma'amadot, these stand-by, the bystanders. Yeah, but in English, bystander means something completely different. But anyway, and as a small footnote, ma'amadot might also remind you of a word you're much more familiar with in Hebrew prayer, Amidah, right? The Amidah, which is the blessings that we do while we are standing, because it's come from some of the same root. And the reason why we do the Amidah 3 times on a weekday and 4 times on a festival is because that parallels the precise number of sacrifices that were offered. 2 plus a bonus on a weekday, and then a bonus on Shabbat called Musaf. So whenever people ask me, we did the Amidah during Shacharit, and then we had the Torah service, and now we're doing the Amidah again, what's the deal? Well, yeah, God asked for a bonus sacrifice on Shabbat, and so therefore we're going to give a bonus Amidah on Shabbat, and that's called Musaf, which means bonus. We're not creative when it comes to naming. It's one of our greatest weaknesses. Everything sounds beautiful in Hebrew, though. It's just if you translate it, it gets boring. All right, so we now continue with the big question. Because so far what we've discovered is our ancestors really cared about the sacrifices. And they might have really enjoyed hearing about the sacrifices. But that may still leave us a little question, why bother talking about the sacrifices so much? Why bother doing the sacrifices so much? What was the big deal about all this? And doesn't it really just seem like God is being brought his lunch? And doesn't that make us feel a bit uncomfortable too? So Sefer HaChinuch, in his inimitable fashion, tries to blend this understanding to get us moving down the deeper view of sacrifices.
Israel was commanded that they should sacrifice through the servants of God, may he be blessed, who are the priests, 2 unblemished 1-year-old lambs as a burnt offering daily, 1 in the morning and the 2nd in the afternoon, as it is stated in Numbers. And nonetheless, the main warning is to the court, meaning to say the sages, the deciders of the Torah in Israel, as the work of the community is incumbent upon them. And it is likely they said.
It is like they said in Sifrei.
Oh, it's like they said.
Right. So if you want to go look at the proof text of why it ends up being on the shoulders of the court, then you can go to Sifrei to look that up, which again, Sefaria online, wonderful website, has almost all of these texts translated. And what he's trying to argue here is that, yes, we were supposed to do these sacrifices, but when we say we are supposed to do the sacrifices, we don't mean me. We mean the Kohanim, but even when we say the Kohanim, they may be the instrument, but they are not the ones responsible. They need to be turned on, if you will. You have to throw the switch, and the people who are actually responsible for making sure that it happens is the court, right? Is the Beit Din, or the Chachamim, the sages. There has to be someone. Ultimately, the buck stops there. And that's what the sages argued, was that ultimately it was the court's responsibility to make sure that the process continued as was appropriate.
But practically speaking, if I understand correctly, these, I think, 2 unblemished lambs in the morning and another in the afternoon.
Yeah.
But isn't this the food for the Kohanim? And if they don't keep it going, maybe people will start getting lazy and not bring their animals to sacrifice, and then the Kohanim won't have what to eat.
So this food was not nearly enough to satisfy the population of the Kohanim. So that there were other sacrifices and other gifts that were given to the Kohanim that were their actual.
But you gotta make sure to keep doing that.
Bread and butter,
lazy,
if you will.
Yeah. You get lazy and say, oh,
Right.
We don't have to do it again.
Right. But we still haven't got to the meaning yet, which is
No,
why
that's
he is going to give us a little more.
We were commanded in this regular service, which is twice a day, with the rising of the sun and with its inclining toward the evening, in order that we be aroused from this action and that we place all of our hearts and all of our thoughts to cling to God, blessed be He.
All right, so let's make sure we understand what he's saying here. Is why have sacrifices twice a day?
So that twice a day we turn our hearts to God. And
Exactly. So we think about God at least twice a day. Right? That is important all day, but during the day you need these course correction points where you drag yourself away from your actions back and towards God. It doesn't mean that you stop what you're doing, although you do have to nowadays, because we stop what we're doing when we're doing our prayers, which, like I said, have taken the place of the sacrifice. But we do turn our heart towards God, and at these 2 points. And why these 2 points? He explains.
We have said several times that a person is acted upon and his nature is aroused according to the involvement of his actions.
Right. The more you do, the more you actually care about what you're doing. Right? If you just sit there and think about something, it doesn't move you spiritually at all. Well, almost nothing at all. But if you get up and engage in an action, all of a sudden you're having an impact on your soul as well.
So that a man's nature is designed that he needs to prepare nourishment for himself twice, morning and evening.
By the way, that was the ancient menu setting. Nowadays, people eat a little more than that. But in the old world, you ate 2 meals a day on average, which was why on Shabbat, you got a third meal, right? Seudah Shlishi, or Shalshidus, as it's pronounced in some communities. Right? That was a bonus meal that you ate on Shabbat. But every other day of the week, you just had 2 meals, and you were lucky if you had both of those.
So that's why he is commanded that he place his industry and his occupation in the occupation of the service of his Creator 2 times as well, that the service of the servant to himself not be more than his service to his master.
Right? Imagine if you are a slave, right? If you're serving your master and your master asks that you take care of him, you would expect that you would take care of the master at least as much as you would take care of yourself. So if I'm going to eat twice a day, the master needs to have his food twice a day. Good. Makes sense. Beautiful. Arouse our spirit. Serve the master as much as we serve ourselves. Wonderful, wonderful feeling. But aren't we getting closer and closer to saying that we're preparing God breakfast and dinner?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because we just literally use the metaphor of providing for our own nourishment as being the template of why God asked for a morning and late afternoon sacrifice. And that seems awfully close to I'm feeding God. But don't worry, we're going to back up from this.
So why all of this? In order to regularly arouse his spirit and his desire to remember his creator. And through this, to make his actions proper and be blessed. As Hashem is the one who desires kindness. And as they expounded in Sifrei, a fire of pleasing smell to the Lord, since I said, and my will was done. Meaning to say that the entire portion of the hire from any sacrifice is only his desire, blessed be he, that the servant do what his master has commanded him in order that he be fit to merit his goodness.
Okay, so a little complicated.
Yes, very.
Let's try and unpack this a little bit. He's saying God doesn't care about the food, right? He's not saying it yet, although other commentators will. It's not that God is eating the sacrifice. In fact, the portion of the sacrifice that moves God, that satiates God, is that it was done according to God's will, that you behaved in the way that God had commanded. That is the content of the sacrifice that God cares about in particular. Now, the particulars are still important because doing the particulars means you're following God's command. Right? So it's not as though we can say, oh, I can just bypass the particulars because God doesn't care about those. No, God cared enough about those particulars to command them in the first place. But what God is looking for is not just the particulars as though he needed those. Right? God doesn't need a lamb. God doesn't need the libation. But what God is really looking for and enjoying, if you want to use a very anthropomorphic term, is the fact that you did it in the first place.
So is the pleasing odor like a metaphor for this idea of doing it the right way?
Exactly. So let's take
It's mentioned several times. It seems to be the only thing that God really wants.
So let's take it as a and the sages do fixate on the fact that it is the reach nichoach, this intangible aroma that is considered to be the high point of the sacrifice, as to say that's further evidence that God doesn't care about the flesh and blood, because obviously no one's getting fat off of eating smoke. New diet regime, just eat smoke for a month. But what they're also trying to say is more akin to, let's go back to our coffee metaphor. Again, I don't really love coffee all that much, but imagine you do. And imagine that your spouse customarily is the one who gets up first and who makes the coffee for you, right? So every morning you wake up and you smell the coffee in the house. Now, on the one hand, I want the coffee, right? I need the coffee because I'm human, I'm flesh and blood. But is the smell and my enjoyment of that smell just because I want the coffee? Or does it smell good because I know it represents the love that my spouse is showing me by preparing that cup as I'm about to wake up? Well, it may depend on the relationship, and that's exactly the point. So if you found out that your spouse wasn't making it, but that someone else was just stopping by and making a pot of coffee, would it smell as good? Right? Would it smell as good? It might physically be exactly the same aroma permeating the house, but knowing that smell represents the love, the devotion, the care, the what they want to do for you, that I think makes it a more pleasing aroma than just the molecules that happen to be wafting through the air. And so too, that's what God is trying to tell us, is that God is not fixated on chewing. It's not that he wants a lamb for breakfast. It's he wants us to be practicing the discipline and the behaviors that he has commanded. And when we do, as symbolized by the sacrifices taking place and the smoke going up, that is what is making God say, these are people worthy of my blessing.
Another thought that's entered my little brain is that this smell does waft over the community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so people have the proof that this sacrifice is happening.
We also know that our community is involved in something, even if we're not there individually. It's one reason why in the modern world, to use a very pale imitation of the power of the ancient rite, when a congregation sends out an email, sends out a bulletin, when you get a flyer, even if you don't plan on attending the event, even if you don't plan on being there that Shabbat, although you should, it makes you feel good to be part of a congregation that is doing things. If we send out an email that says, a congregation in Israel, donated 500 pounds of food to the local food bank, even if you didn't put a can in, you feel good knowing that you're part of a community that smells like that gives off that aroma. Yeah. And that permeates because it represents the values that you also want to support, even if you didn't support that particular instance. And if you did support it, all the more so, then it makes you feel good. So that is sort of where Sefer HaChinuch is going with this. But we still really need to deal with this eating the sacrifices a little bit more, because a lot of people get confused by this. So we're going to continue. This time we're going to look in Sifrei itself.
So it says sacrifices to the Lord.
Right, to the Lord. Remember, anytime you see the word Lord in the translation, it is almost always representing the tetragrammaton, the Yud, He, Vav, He, the four-letter name of God. So what this commentary is trying to figure out for us is, why did it say a sacrifice to the Lord, to what we would pronounce as Adonai? Why not mention one of the other names of God?
Shimon ben Azai says, come and see that with all the offerings of the Torah, it is not written of them Elohim or El or Shaddai or Tzebaot, but only Yod He Vav He, the tetragrammaton.
Right. So if you look through the entire Torah, he's arguing, and I encourage you to do this each year. It never says make a sacrifice to Elohim. It never says make a sacrifice to Tzebaot or to El or to Shaddai. It never says make a sacrifice to any word other than the Yud, He, Vav, He, the four-letter name of God, usually translated as Lord.
That is so as not to give an opening to the heretics for their heresies.
So what would their heresies be? This sacrifice is for El, this sacrifice is for Elohim, this sacrifice is for Tzebaot, and that somehow those are distinct deities, that those are other gods. But by having only one name of God receiving all the sacrifices throughout the entire Torah, it's very clear that there is only one God.
Is the tetragrammaton also the compassion version?
And is also the word that is used for the aspect of God that is most what we would call compassionate, yes.
Yeah, where Elohim is more like judgmental.
Correct.
Justice form, sorry.
Exactly.
Justice form. Well, some other religions will say, well, Jews do these sacrifices out of duty, out of obligations, out of mechanical, out of stuff like that, but they're not reading the scripture.
Which is unfortunate, and a
It's very,
misunderstanding.
very important.
Well, and a misunderstanding of what the word duty means. Because as you were working through your synonyms, you got down to the word mechanical, which is exactly where they go.
Right.
But duty does not mean rote. Right? Duty and obligation does not mean mechanical. Duty and obligation ought to mean love.
Right.
I have a duty to something because I love that thing. If I have duty to my country, it's because I love my country. If I have a duty to my spouse or to my children, it's because I have a love for my spouse and my children.
You make coffee for them.
I do occasionally make coffee for them, yes. Not for myself, but I will make it which shows the devotion I have. I'm willing to make coffee for them. Although I can't claim that it's great coffee. Onward.
And just as a sweet savor,
that's the reach nichoach, this pleasing odor,
is written in respect to an ox, so it is written in respect to a lamb and in respect to a bird, whereby the Torah teaches us that there is no eating or drinking before the Holy One, blessed be He, but that His only gratification is that He speaks and His will is done.
All right, so what difference does it make between the fact that it says this reach nichoach, this sweet odor, between a bird, a lamb, and an ox? Why give us the list?
It's not that He likes birds better than oxen.
Exactly. God doesn't care about the individual animal. I mean, yes, He cared enough to give orders about which animal should be at which event, but it's not because God likes the taste of one more than the other.
Well,
because the pleasing odor of a bird is exactly the same as the pleasing odor of an ox, even though an ox is billions of times more expensive and valuable, and in usual cases tastier than the bird. But God, for him, they're the same by the time it reaches him. Why? Because we did what we were supposed to do at each of those moments. That was what God wanted.
In the prophets, I think Isaiah says, I own the cattle in 1,000 hills. If I was hungry, I would go ahead and get one.
Well,
I'm paraphrasing big time.
Just hold on for a second, because we're actually going to get from Psalms and Leviticus a little bit more reminding us that God doesn't need food.
So it's written in Psalms, were I hungry, I would not tell you, for mine is the world and its fullness. I know every bird in the mountains, and the creatures of the field are with me.
Right? So God doesn't need us to feed God. God has an entire supermarket available. It's called Earth. And what are we offering? Some of God's own creation back to God, because God couldn't feed himself. God could create an entire another planet if God wanted to, if he just wanted to chew on something. Again, not that God has a mouth and chew
We're
it.
just tenants.
We are, exactly.
There's a big sidebar, let's not go there.
Onward.
So just in case I think God eats and drinks, it is written in Psalms, do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of he-goats? Why then do I ask you to sacrifice to me to do my will? And thus it's written in Leviticus, when you sacrifice a thanks offering to the Lord, it is to your favor that you sacrifice it.
Right. It's not doing God a favor. It's doing us a favor.
Yeah.
Now, God doesn't need it. As if we stop the sacrifices, which we have been forced to do for the last 2,000 years, God's not starving because God wasn't eating in the first place. Make sense? Okay. All right. So let's.
No, there's not a plastic offering. I digress. Okay.
Well, no. You're right, but because there are some cultures that have a sacrificial tendency in them,
Right.
that will replace an offering with a painting, or will replace it with a plastic substitute in certain circumstances, and we don't do that,
We need to talk.
right? And we don't do that.
We have a plastic problem. Okay.
Even when the temple stood,
Mhm.
God said through the prophets, I don't need the sacrifice.
Okay.
Let me paraphrase that again. I don't need just the sacrifice,
Yeah, I don't need
empty of anything else, right? Just showing up with buckets of cows
Is
and
meaningless.
then going and abusing the poor or violating any other
Right.
commandment
And that's why
is not good.
That's why
Better to keep your cows.
sacrifices were
Yes.
actually going on.
Yes. So the potential for hypocrisy in the sacrificial system was something that almost all of the prophets at one point or another railed against, some more than others. And that's the problem when it's a physical action that becomes divorced from the intention. Right? When the physical action becomes the only point, then it can become mechanical. Then it can become rote. And then it becomes what I would call really superstition rather than religious duty, and certainly not coming from a place of love.
But that's why.
But that doesn't mean that sacrifices are inherently mechanical or rote. It doesn't mean that they are inherently devoid of value. It just means that they can be stripped of value, but so can any action of devotion, right? That making of the coffee, it could be done in the morning by a spouse who is preparing to divorce the other person and doesn't care about them anymore, but they've been making it for 20 years, and you know what? They're just gonna keep making it. But there's no more love in that aroma because they're 1 foot out the door. They can still make the coffee because that's just what they've been doing, but that doesn't mean the love is there anymore. So the symbol behind it really only works when you're also convinced of the love that comes with it. And that's what all of our commentators are trying to say, is that God doesn't just want the action, he wants the action with the love so that the action has the appropriate meaning.
And if you put them both together, the last time which I read, when you sacrifice a thanks offering to the Lord, it is to your favor that you sacrifice, because it reminds you to give thanks to something. Otherwise, you take things for granted. But if you have to stop and say, "Oh, it's so nice that you did that for me. I'm offering a sacrifice."
Right.
It reminds you as well.
And also one of the reasons why we continue to have our daily prayer services in the same order and the same time periods as when the sacrifices were done, because they do fill a very necessary spiritual and psychological need. All right, let's continue with the Kuzari.
All that is contained in the order of sacrificial service is to be done in the utmost purity and holiness. It is called service of the Lord and the bread of your God. and similar terms which relate to God's pleasure in the beautiful harmony prevailing among the people and the priesthood. God accepts their hospitality and dwells among them in order to show them honor.
In order to show them honor.
Right.
It's not because God is there because it helps God. God is there, in quotes, obviously God is everywhere, as an honor for them. And people drives that point.
God, however, is most holy and far too exalted to find pleasure in their meat and drink. It is for their own benefit.
Drives the point home very nicely, I think. Yehuda Halevi had a good turn of phrase. All right, Chizkuni, a little more modern, is going to bring us back to this whole question about sacrifices. And I'm going to end up hopefully giving us a nice connection back to our opening talk about the blessings over the Torah reading itself.
To present to me at its appointed time. This applies even if the appointed time occurs on the Sabbath, or if the person offering it is temporarily ritually unclean.
I've had people ask me, like, wait a minute, Rabbi, we're not allowed to slaughter an animal on Shabbat, right? If I have a cow and I plan to eat the cow on Sunday, I can't slaughter it and strip its hide and hang it up on Shabbat so that I can eat it the next day. But if I'm in the temple, I can. That is to say, if I'm in the temple and it's time for the daily sacrifice, then the knife is across the animal's throat. It's going to be slaughtered on Shabbat, right? So the sacrifices within the appropriate setting and done the appropriate way, they supersede the restrictions of work on Shabbat. I know, it's like, wait a minute. Shabbat is such a huge bar of a standard, but sacrifices do go one step beyond Shabbat for the sacrifice of that day. Now, voluntary sacrifices and other sacrifices that you have an option of when to bring them, of course, we're not bringing them on Shabbat. But the daily sacrifices, the ones that are mandated to be done either every day or the one that's also done on Shabbat, that's happening on Shabbat, even though outside of the sacrifices, we would never be doing that melacha, that work.
And that's, he said, even if the person offering it is temporarily ritually unclean. So according to the author, this must mean if no priest can be found on that day who is ritually pure, this offering must not be skipped even during time of war.
Which would be the greatest source of ritual impurity because of the number of bodies that would be everywhere. Yeah, the dead.
We find that the angel remonstrated with Joshua for not having seen to it that this offering was offered while the army laid siege to Jericho.
All right, so what? Joshua, Jericho, angel, sacrifices? What's going on here? All right, so we have to go look in the Talmud for this. This is from a debate in the Talmud about if you are observing another mitzvah and it comes time to read the Megillah, do you stop the other mitzvah to go do the Megillah reading? And they eventually get into this discussion about Joshua and Jericho and this angel. It's chapter 5 of Joshua, and it's this whole image of this angel appearing, and Joshua doesn't quite recognize him at first. It seems a little unclear what's going on. And the angel shows up in the evening time. That's an important part of our story, but one that doesn't really fit in otherwise.
Is the service more important than Torah study?
And anytime you see the word service used in Talmudic text like this, it's always talking about avodah, meaning the temple service, sacrifices, and all of that.
So is that more important than Torah study? Isn't it written, and it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood over against him and bowed down.
Right, so there's a lot that goes on in the middle there, but it wouldn't fit on the page, and the Talmud doesn't quote it all either. The point being that this is an angel that Joshua is encountering at this moment. And they're going to use this incident to try and teach us the answer of which is more important, the sacrifices or Torah study.
The Talmud explains that the angel said, yesterday, you neglected the afternoon daily offering due to the impending battle. And now, at night, you have neglected Torah study, and I have come to rebuke you. Joshua said to him, for which of these sins have you come?
Right, so it's always a good question to ask the person who's chastising you. So you've told me I've done two things wrong, but which one are you actually here to chew me out over?
Okay.
And the answer is?
The angel said to Joshua, I have come now, indicating that neglecting Torah is worse.
Right, you did two things wrong. You didn't offer the daily sacrifice because the war was coming up, and you're not studying in the evening. Which is worse? The one I actually showed up for, which was the evening mistake, the neglect of Torah study. So officially, Torah study does take priority over the daily sacrifices if you are in a position where you have to create a hierarchy. Now, thankfully, for most of our times, we're able to do all of them both of them very easily and not have to worry about a conflict. But this is trying to remind us of the importance of Torah study, which is why we go back to our opening 3 blessings that were quoted from the Siddur, or at least the versions that were found in Rambam's. And even though we're quoting the daily sacrifices as part of our celebration of God's Torah, we're doing that subsumed under our celebration of Torah. So we slide the sacrifices in so we can do both of them at the same time. We're studying Torah and doing the sacrifices by recalling them, but it is still Torah that has primacy. So as much as we may be disheartened that the sacrifices are gone, that we cannot perform this duty as God commanded, therefore we don't have the option to engage and connect to God in this particular way, we still have both the tefillah, the prayers themselves, which allow us to duplicate much of the same role and function as the sacrifices. And even more, we have the superior version of a connection, which is called Torah study itself, which does take precedence over the sacrifices in any event. So we may have lost one, but we still have the greater of the two, which is good because you've come for the greater of the two. You've come for Torah study. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Nothing for me.